It's September 1939, and Europe has descended into the blackness of armed conflict for the second time in 20 years. Although it is early in the war, the Axis powers effectively dominate Central Europe, splitting and isolating Allied forces. By June of 1940, the Nazis have forced the surrender of France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Belgium, Austria, Poland and Slovakia. Before their early rampage is done, they and their erstwhile ally Italy will also dominate large swaths of territory in northern Africa. Although she had been the leading naval power of the world for 3 centuries, the British find themselves in danger of losing access to the critical sea lanes of the Mediterranean Sea. Without maritime access to their outposts in the eastern Mediterranean, they will lose their oil supplies and most likely, the war. But the British have a problem. An Italian fleet of battleships, stationed at the port of Taranto, poses a threat to the ability of the Brits to resupply their forces in Egypt. Being severely outnumbered, the British have to come up with a new answer. On November 11, 1940, their solution will make history in a day and lead to 2 of the most pivotal events in world history.
This video is presented by History in Days. This channel will focus on how the events of a single day can change history in ways no one could predict at the time. We will be publishing a series of short, 10-minute videos for all 365 days of the year. If you like history from a different perspective, or are just curious about how and why events interconnect, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And to receive notices of our new videos, please also click on the bell. And we will see you in your history in days that follow.
From the middle of the 15th century to the late 1800s, sea power was based on sailing ships. Made of wood, propelled by acres of sails, these ships were perhaps the first true high-tech weapons the world had ever known. The basic tactic was for the enemy fleets to form parallel battle lines and bombard each other with broadsides of cannon shot, until one side or the other was sunk or forced to capitulate. Some of these ships carried as many as 100 cannon, and the battle line with more big gun cannon usually won the battle. The nation with the most ships of the battle line, or battleships as they came to be known, was the most powerful in the world. Britain enjoyed several advantages which helped propel it to a position of dominance in the Age of Sail. It was an island nation, with a population well acquainted with the sea. It was situated on the western edge of the European continent, shielded somewhat by the English Channel from adversaries. The best sailing ships were made from hardwoods. It is estimated that some 2,000 of these trees were required to build just one ship of the line. This made England's abundant hardwood forests as valuable as today's oil wells. Although Spain and Portugal had seized the early lead in shipbuilding technology, by the early 1500s Britain was overtaking them and becoming the world's dominant sea power, a position she would maintain for the next 350 years. One of the earliest leaders of British sea power was Sir Francis Drake. In 1577, Drake was one of the first Europeans to circumnavigate, or sail all the way around the world. Later, it was he who led the outnumbered but more seaworthy British fleet to victory over the Armada the Spanish had sent in hopes of punishing England and Queen Elizabeth I for raiding their treasure ships returning from the Western Hemisphere. From 1803 to 1815, it was her navy's big guns that prevented Britain's destruction. It was at this time that perhaps the greatest of all British naval figures emerged. Against overwhelming odds and employing unorthodox tactics, Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British fleet to a decisive victory over the French and Spanish at Trafalgar. Although he tragically died from the injuries he sustained in the battle, Nelson's victory put an end to the dreams of total European conquest of Napoleon Bonaparte. There would be no invasion of England. After the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy enforced the Pax Britannica for almost 100 years. During this time, the British mercantile empire reached its zenith, encompassing 25% of the world's land area and population. Very few institutions created by human beings are perfect, and certainly the British Empire had its faults. However, it is a fact that, because of its navy, an island nation of just under 51 million, governed an empire with a population of over 531 million at its height. And the world enjoyed almost 100 years of relative peace and prosperity. But a situation so out of balance could not last forever. And in 1914, the gathering storm clouds were overwhelming. Britain's navy could no longer enforce the 100-year peace. Pax Britannica came to an end and the world was plunged into war. In the years between the American Civil War and the outbreak of World War I, the world's navies underwent a transformation unlike anything seen for 500 years. Gone were the wooden hulls, replaced by iron and steel. Sail power was replaced by coal and oil. But big guns still ruled the seas. The British and Germans in particular, went into a frenzy to build enough of these dreadnoughts. England sought to maintain her dominance. Germany sought to challenge her. In addition to England and Germany, France, Italy, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire also felt compelled to join this arms race. Even Austria, a country essentially landlocked, built a small fleet of battleships. And on the fringes of the world, upstart naval powers America and Japan built powerful fleets to assert their new place in the pecking order of nations. Ominously, the entire world was preparing for war. With the outbreak of World War I on July 28, 1914, England and Germany had an opportunity to use their battleship fleets. The Battle of Jutland was fought between May 31 and June 1, 1916. It matched the Grand Fleet of England against the High Seas Fleet of Germany. It was the only major naval action of WW1. It was also the last time in history that a major naval battle was fought by two fleets composed solely of big gun battleships. World War I also witnessed the introduction of another new weapon. The first use of the airplane in war was for reconnaissance. But soon men realized that machine guns fired from the air could devastate troops on the ground. Shortly thereafter, pilots made another discovery, and battles between opposing airplanes became common. The dogfight was born in the skies of Europe. The airplane quickly became a potent instrument of war. The war to end all wars ended in November of 1918. Almost immediately, the so-called Great Powers began a brand new arms race. They picked up where they had left off, and once again started building bigger and more powerful warships. This time it got so expensive, that the war-battered national treasuries of Europe could not afford it. The answer? A new treaty to limit the numbers and size of the warships built by each country. And so, the representatives of the victorious European nations plus the United States and Japan, met in Washington in 1922 and again in London in 1930. Their aim was to craft a treaty which would cool the arms race by imposing limits on the size of each country's fleet of battleships. But as happened so often, the diplomats and politicians ignored a transformational development in the real world. Their blindness led to a crucial loophole in the treaty. While the diplomats and their committees met, other men worked to combine air and sea power. They saw that the nation that replaced its battleship big gun fleet with ships that used airplanes to project power would rule the waves and therefore, the world. Pioneers like Edwin Dunning, Eugene Ely, Clement Ader and Billy Mitchell slowly overcame opposition to their vision. These men realized that with the advent of air combat, it was just a matter of time before the days of the big gun navies were over. But they faced opposition and the question remained. Could the tiny airplanes of the day actually sink an all-powerful big gun battleship of the kind that had ruled the waves for 500 years? Most experts didn't think it possible. So, in July of 1921, the U.S. Navy held an experiment to test the claims of the advocates of naval air power. A World War I German battleship Ostfriesland was anchored in Chesapeake Bay and bombarded by airplanes. Although the ship had been stationary, and did not fire back, the point had been proven. Airplanes could, in fact, sink the mighty battleship. All that was needed now, was a new kind of ship designed so that planes could take off and land on them. Remember the diplomats negotiating the Naval Limitations Treaty? By the time agreement was reached, many nations already had more battleships than the treaty allowed, and would be required to scuttle the excess. But because the diplomats did not believe that naval airpower would ever replace big guns, the treaty allowed the conversion of excess battleships into ships that carried airplanes. And so, the aircraft carrier was born. The first aircraft carriers were in reality, simply battleships with a landing strip built on top. Suddenly, nations all over the world found the treaty loophole which allowed them to make aircraft carriers out of battleships they would have had to scrap, and the numbers of aircraft carriers increased rapidly. Three countries in particular built up their fleets of aircraft carriers: Britain, the United States, and Japan. Then in 1939 Europe plunged back into conflict. The early years of WW II saw the Axis powers control most of Europe and northern Africa. Left to fight on alone, the British needed to keep control of the oil fields of the Middle East, to have any chance of winning the war. But Italian and German forces continued to pressure the outnumbered and undersupplied British Army. To defend these critical resources, the British had to be able to resupply and reinforce their Middle East units from their bases at Gibraltar and Malta. But the British have a problem. A powerful Italian fleet of 6 battleships plus numerous smaller craft is based at the port of Taranto. While it exists, this force can effectively block any British support for their eastern Mediterranean garrison. To deal with this threat, the British decide to see if their new aircraft carrier, Illustrious, can actually destroy the Italian battleships. Operating at night to preserve the element of surprise, the British sent the carrier from their base at Alexandria to a position 200 miles southeast of Taranto on November 11, 1940. It launched 24 antiquated Swordfish biplanes, which attacked the anchored Italian fleet. They sunk or damaged 3 battleships. In one night, the Italian Navy had lost half its capital fleet, and would not be able to prevent British resupply missions, thereby saving the Middle East oil resources and keeping Britain in the war. History in a day had been made. Now let's see what happened in the days that followed. The first carrier aircraft attack had been planned and commanded by British Admiral Andrew Cunningham. He was quoted afterwards as saying,
"The night of November 11, 1940, should be remembered forever, as having shown once and for all, that in the fleet air arm, the Navy has its most devastating weapon."
On the other side of the world, a far different admiral of a far different fleet was watching and listening as the era of battleship dominance came to an end. Scarcely a year later, Japanese Admiral Ishiro Yamamoto would apply the lessons of Taranto on a much larger, far more consequential scale. Taking a page from Cunningham, Yamamoto assembled a force of 6 carriers with approximately 182 aircraft. Moving before an actual declaration of war, and maintaining radio silence to preserve his own particular brand of surprise, these forces advanced to within 300 miles of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto expects his carrier-borne airplanes to catch and sink the battleships and carriers of the American Pacific Fleet. Once within range, just before 8 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, the airplanes attacked the battleships in the harbor. In the space of just a few hours, those planes were able to sink or damage 5 battleships, plus 13 other ships, and kill thousands of Americans. In an ironic twist, all the American carriers were at sea, and survived the attack. It would prove to be the one fortuitous development on a day when air power established its dominance over the big gunships. The era of the battleship as the dominant warship was truly over. But if anyone still wasn't convinced, more proof that even the most skeptical would have to accept, would be provided in just a few months near a little Pacific atoll called Midway. On June 6, 1942, barely 6 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor failed to destroy the U.S. carriers, they paid the price. They want to draw the outnumbered U.S. fleet out and crush it, once and for all. They hope that by attacking the U.S. base on Midway Island, while simultaneously threatening Alaska, they can lure the American carriers out to battle. If their plan is successful, America's west coast will be essentially undefended, and vulnerable to invasion. The Japanese assemble a force to strike Midway consisting of 38 gunships versus just 25 for the Americans, including a 7-0 advantage in battleships. Most importantly, they enjoy a 4-3 advantage over the Americans in carriers. They have every reason to expect another victory. But the United States has 2 critical advantages the Japanese never saw coming, that turn the battle in the Americans' favor. First, thanks to the successful efforts of American codebreakers, headed by John Rochefort, U.S. Commander Admiral Nimitz knows exactly what the Japanese are planning. He moves his carriers into position to ambush the Japanese fleet as it approaches Midway. The Japanese are caught unawares by the proximity of American naval airpower, and their forces are thrown into confusion by the unexpected U.S. airstrikes. The second advantage is the fact that big gunships had become effectively irrelevant as offensive weapons of war, negating the Japanese advantage. Midway becomes the first naval battle whose outcome is decisively determined by air power. Dealing a stunning blow to the proud Japanese Navy, airplanes from the American carriers sink 2 of their heavy cruisers and all 4 of their carriers. In return, Japanese aircraft are able to sink 1 American carrier and 1 destroyer. Tellingly, not one ship is sunk by the big guns of either fleet. Today, it is universally accepted that the dominant navies are those that can deliver air power to all corners of the world. Ships based on big guns, and their successors, the long-range missile, still serve the defensive role of protecting the Queen of the Seas, the aircraft carrier. And it all began one night when, for the first time, airplanes took off from a carrier and sank battleships. November 11, 1940. A history in days.